The coward that was the midday sun finally made an appearance. A grayish-gold obscured orb, mostly hidden behind thick clouds, was still about as close to a clear day as one would ever see in Barovia. Yet the irony was not lost on anyone in the reluctantly gathered audience. The timing of this rarity so fitting, a mockery of life in this domain of dread, as a hush fell over the meager crowd, silently instructed to watch as a hooded figure of the executioner raised his axe, the polished blade of steel glinting cruelly in a lone sunbeam. The executioner wore a mask, but everyone knew it was the town's butcher. Not a florid adjective to describe the grim task that lay before him, he was literally the town's butcher of what little livestock the realm still produced. The mask, then. Appearances? Perhaps tradition. Maybe it made him feel better. But there was no need to blame him. He had about as much choice in the matter as the young man strapped down to that pillory, his neck now fully exposed. A refusal would only mean someone else would take the blade and he would be there next. So any compassion, empathy for the victim, or even disgust at the job had to be restrained, for it's always better to be alive than beheaded and dead. The criminal, more like victim, a young man barely past adolescence, face streaked with escaping tears as he waited the downstroke of the sharpened axe, his eyes wide with a terror that echoed in the hearts of every onlooker. His crime? A handful of tarnished coins he had hidden from his family's tax tribute to the lord of this realm. The axe fell with a sickening thud, and the head rolled to a stop near the feet of a small boy, his face paling further than that of the recently departed. This was the justice of Count Strahd von Zarovich, the brutal reality of life in Barovia. Welcome back, brave traveler. I'm delighted to see you've yet to be consumed by the many evils that are likely hunting you at this very moment. And yet somehow you have successfully found Volume 3 of my survival guide. Strange how it just appeared in your travel pack, wouldn't you agree? Like some form of magic, one might say. I do hope you read Volume 1 front to back and at least skimmed Volume 2, since it covered the full von Zarovich bloodline as well as the ancient histories of this realm from a time before the Dark Powers tore it from the material plane. If so, then one might say you are as prepared as a lone traveler can be, given such a nightmare domain of dread that you still find yourself within. So let me formally present to you the Traveler's Guide to the Myths of Ravenloft, Volume 3. But more than a traveler's guide, in reality Volume 3 is an atlas of survival dedicated entirely to the grim realities, locales, and hazards of Barovia. No more academic research or ancient history classes for you, my friend. This volume is about the here and the now, and the evils you will soon face. Now, before we are to delve into the terrors of this cursed land, let us address a scholarly puzzle, one that plagues many a sage and adventurer alike, and if not addressed, could lead you astray and into the arms of an undead, a lycanthropic servant, or, your gods forbid, the Count himself. I speak, of course, on the discrepancies found in the legends and lore of Ravenloft across the ages. The modern text, well, let's just say they've taken certain liberties with the established lore. It's a bit like finding a perfectly aged vintage wine, only to then discover someone's added grape juice to its delicate blend. Quite a fitting analogy given Barovia's love of wines. The original text, those glorious Gothic tomes of the 2nd and 3rd edition eras, paint a far more expansive and frankly terrifying picture of Barovia, but they were the most accurate. And when it comes to your survival and escape from any domain of dread, accuracy is far more important than not hurting your feelings or scaring you too much. The realm of Barovia is far less the isolated medieval land of gloom as painted in those modern texts of 5th edition, and more a sprawling, festering collection of many wounds across many diverse lands, each deadly in their own unique ways, where most everything you see, hear, touch, or even taste will look to harm you in some way. You see, those modern authors and their 5e texts often compose a tamer, one might even say simplified, tune of dread. They only draw inspiration from the original symphonies of horror, and sadly for me, but most deadly for you, the modern texts have, in many ways, been rewritten, or retconned as the kids these days might say, entire sections of the lore, a cardinal sin in my humble opinion. The result is like trying to piece together a puzzle as though your life depends on it, where some of the pieces have been, well, creatively reshaped or are completely missing. But that's enough get-off-my-lawn analogies from a grumpy old sage, well, at least for now anyway. The newer writings, they are not all bad, quite the contrary in some respects. They have succeeded in the discovery of new lore to answer questions and fill in the gaps where the original texts were obscured or even left unknown. The Amber Temple, for instance, is a delightful finding that colors, at least in part, the origins of Strahd's dark pact with ancient evils, from pages left mostly blank in the original writings. Or take the introduction of vestiges like Vampire, manifesting as agents which only hint at a potentially fractured lineage of the dark powers that curse these domains of dread and manipulate its Dark Lord ruler, each getting us a step closer to the real buried truths of these prison realms. These are just a few of the lore additions that are most welcome, supporting or even bolstering the existing narratives, rather than undermining it. But there is also a cost. Some of these adjustments, brought on with the lore of 5th edition, have left some scholars scratching their heads, so we must tread with caution. I tell you all this, my dear traveler, so as you navigate this land, you will remember the lore you may have heard in a local tavern, or even hold dear, might not always align with the whispers of the old world, the real Barovia. So I ask that you trust in the depth of the ancient tales this 3rd volume will share with you, for they carry the true weight of Barovia's sorrow and may just offer you a path home. Like any veteran explorer knows, a successful expedition begins with thorough preparation. And part of our prep is to make sure you are familiar with 3 important terms that were established in the 2nd and 3rd edition lore and will be used often throughout the remainder of this series, regardless of which domain of dread we might find ourselves in. The first is called false histories. The Dark Powers really have thought of most everything in their genius but sinister design on these domains. The mists, supernatural fogs that isolate these domains of dread from the prime material plane, they possess the ability to manipulate the minds of most of its inhabitants, even the Dark Lords, although there are some rare exceptions. One important facet to this manipulation, crucial in maintaining order, is the implanting of false memories. The best and most widespread example of this happens the moment a new domain is created or pulled from another world. At this time, the Dark Powers implant a complete but false history of the realm in the minds of each of its denizens. This fabricated past can be very elaborate, referring to named people, places, dates, and even detailed events, some of which never happened but are ingrained as a 100% truth to all the people native to the domain. The ruse is so well done that even the books, tomes, codices, even works of art, along with any other chronicle of the realm's past, will reference this as a factual history. Another term you should be aware of are dread possibilities. This lore is presented as possible secrets, rumors, and legends that are meant to be molded and shaped by world builders and dungeon masters as campaign lore or even adventure hooks. As the name suggests, these are only possibilities, and each may or may not hold true in each of your worlds. And finally, this volume will often mention the core. And no, it's not an outlandish action thriller riddled with bad science starring Hilary Swank that I have accidentally watched a half a dozen times. No, the core, for those not familiar with the original lore, is the reference to a large contiguous landmass, some might call a continent, that is comprised of many of the domains of dread, similar to how one might view Europe, for example, only on a smaller scale. Now, the core itself deserves more discovery, but it's out of scope for this volume, but rest assured it will be a primer for our journey to the many domains of dread not named Barovia. However, it needs to be mentioned here only because the core is one of the foundational differences between the original lore and what you are told in the 5e resources. In the original, and in my humble opinion, the truth that is the world of Ravenloft, this core is considered to be the mainland of the Domains of Dread, and includes the Sea of Sorrows and the Nocturnal Sea, as well as their associated islands. With the 4th edition lore, the Shadowfell became the new home of these domains, and in the move, isolated each domain within its own demi-plane. That change was further solidified by the 5th edition, and while they did introduce mist talismans to allow travel between domains, for this volume we will be referring to the original lore of the 2nd and 3rd edition, and not those more controversial 4th and 5th edition changes. Now, I'm not here to bash the 5e lore. They were dealt the cards from the 4th edition, and the Shadowfell's not going away. In fact, I like the Shadowfell. But it's not really about love or hate for the change. It's just an inarguable fact that the modern lore in many respects is quite different, so the reality is that each must be covered separately. The 5e lore, including the discussion on domain isolation, the Shadowfell, and domain travel via the Mist Talismans, were covered in Volume 1, which I encourage you to check out. All this is to say, as we progress through these later volumes, the lore will lean heavy into the 2nd and 3rd edition, and I will have a full listing of the sources used at the end of this volume. Additionally, I will be sure to call out these false histories, dread possibilities, as well as the notable 5th edition lore changes and conflicts, all so that you may consider the validity of each and determine your own set of truths. There was a time when this valley was a vibrant land of lush forests and thriving abundance set upon the material plane, but those days are long gone. This volume begins as you have arrived following the horrors of 351 BC, a day that showcased the worst evils of men, where a convergence of betrayal and tragedy claimed countless lives, and where the realm's lord Count von Zarovich lost his own mortality to undeath. All covered in the first 2 volumes of this series. Regardless, it was at that exact moment that Barovia was ripped from the material world and thrown into this demi-plane of eternal exile, a fragmented plane shaped by the unknowable cosmic jailers only semi-officially known as the Dark Powers. Here and now, laid out before you, is a Barovia forever cursed. It is the original realm of Ravenloft, wrapped in equal parts fog and despair, and has stood as the archetype of Dungeons & Dragons Gothic horror for over 4 decades. It's a realm trapped in the iron grip of its Dark Lord, the vampire Strahd von Zarovich. Himself a tragic and villainous figure, he exemplifies the unholy trifecta of power, obsession, and damnation. His influence felt in every corner of the realm. And for you to have any hope of surviving in this textbook example of a realm that embodies Gothic horror, understanding the lay of the land is your most immediate and pressing concern. Now settled in its forever home, this cosmic prison of Barovia would, over the centuries, be joined by many other exiled realms. The collection of these domains of dread, these realms, make up a landmass called the Core, which would eventually be reshaped by a great upheaval called the Grand Conjunction, to also include the Islands of Terror. The cursed land now under your feet lies in the south-central of that core. To the immediate north you find the border to the mysterious Shadow Rift. To the south are the goblin-infested lands of Forlorn. Traveling east from this valley, you will find the domain kingdoms of Nova Vasa and the exotic lands of Haslan, a realm most Therunian natives would find familiar, with its exotic arcane landscapes and eldritch powers, a departure from the Gothic mists of this current valley. To round out Barovia's immediate neighbors, one only needs to travel the Old Svalich Road west to cross into the realms of Sithicus, once ruled by the most famous of Death Knights, Lord Soth, as well as the war-torn domain of Invidia. Like all these domains of dread, Barovia is both a prison and a reflection of the Dark Lord, whose own vile actions are solely responsible for the curse that forever burdens their lands. The lands of Barovia in particular, in and of themselves, are as much a character in the Ravenloft story as the people who walk upon its ground. Barovia's geography is, without question, one of isolation, protected by not only its supernatural mist, when the Dark Lord chooses, but also its own formidable natural borders, namely the Balanok mountain range. The Balanoks are massive, rugged, and frigid peaks, the most notable of which is Mount Baratok, its snow-laden peaks rising just shy of 7,500 feet, acting as a silent guardian over the valley and the realm's highest summit. There's also Mount Sawtooth, with its peak in excess of 7,100 feet, and to the south, Mount Gacchus, smaller but still rising to eclipse 4,600 feet, where its craggy slopes are pierced by icy streams that feed into the river Ivlis. The high passes of this treacherous range are choked off with ice for up to 9 months of the year, made deadly by frigid winds and deep crevasses and gorges that fall into lightless black voids of most certain death. And if the frigid weather or natural dangers of this jagged mountain range are not intimidating enough, there are plenty of supernatural dangers rumored to also call the Balanoks home. Reports of frozen beasts, icy demonic creatures, and even ghosts of past travelers are all said to wander the frigid slopes. These dangerous mountains hide many mysteries, from ancient monasteries, forgotten temples, and secrets unknown. Many an expedition has ventured into these peaks, but far less have returned. Those deadly summits, just like the whole of Barovia, are simply unkind to the living. Around the Balanoks extend its many valleys and foothills. To the northwest you'll find the Dread Mounts, which extend from the foothills of the western Balanoks all the way to the tainted woods of Borka. Venturing southward, you'll begin to get a taste of life for forlorn natives as you cross into the Bloodfang Hills, plagued by feral goblin infestations. Or if you're really unlucky, you might run afoul of the leper baron Eric Reinhold, himself a gruesome and vile vampire hybrid that you should avoid at all costs. Two great forests, Teperich and Svalich woods, dominate this valley, their ancient trees predating even the vampire Lord Strahd's reign, although they have grown more twisted under his dark influence. Make no mistake, though, these woods are not welcoming to those with a beating, warm-blooded heart. They are a corrupted tangle of gnarled oaks and firs. At their feet are a collection of exotic and poisonous flora such as wolfsbane, nightshade, and belladonna that each thrive in the shadows of the forest canopy, their toxic properties just another mirror of a land that seeks to taint the living. Fungi growth is also in abundance, their pale luminescence casting an eerie glow in the forest's dark recesses, its oppressive quiet broken only by the distant howling symphony of wolves and the whispers of the unseen. Rumors speak of ghastly blights and malevolent spirits that stalk the deeper reaches, so know this. Each step taken into its inky depths is a roll of the dice against a land that will not pass on any opportunity to stain your soul or worse. The landscape of Barovia is fed and intersected by 3 major river systems and 3 primary roads. The Gundar River originates in Forlorn and flows through the gorge of Passing Sorrow into Barovia, passing the western edge of the Bloodfang Hills before it enters into Invidia. The Ivlis River flows through Barovia under the very shadow of Castle Ravenloft, with its meandering banks including a long stretch east from Lake Zarovich. It later joins the Ulvand River in Nova Vasa to form an important regional waterway. And then we have the Luna River, which runs westward through Barovia into the domains of Borka and Rishmalo. The Luna River is, in particular, known for its unpredictable and dangerous whitewater rapids. The road network of the realm consists of the Crimson Road, which many call the Gundar Road. This connects Forlorn and Karatakis, traversing south and southeast, while the Warlock's Road runs southwest from Barovia's easternmost settlement Immol into Haslan. But it's the old Svalich Road that serves as Barovia's primary artery across the realm. A snaking ribbon of cracked stone and rutted earth, worn from centuries of use and neglect, have left it scarred. In places, the road seems to crumble beneath your feet, its own cries of despair, as it cuts through the center of the valley, connecting the isolated village of Barovia with the towns of Vallaki and Krezk, as well as extending to both the eastern and western borders. Travelers will quickly notice the forest pressing in close along much of the road's length, the gnarled branches encroaching like ominous accusing fingers across their path. And for those that traverse Old Svalich Road when the fog is most dense, may find that the road ahead seems to vanish before them completely, often leaving the unprepared lost in an oppressive silence broken only by the rustle of watching eyes and unseen horrors lurking in the undergrowth. Despite the dangers, the road still remains the lifeline of Barovia, enabling trade and communication throughout this beleaguered land. Rounding out the landscape of the realm, there are two significant bodies of water to detail, Tesser Pool and Lake Zarovich, both of which play roles in the domain's geography and lore. Tesser Pool is the encampment for the Zarovich clan of the people known as Vistani. Residing under the shadow of Castle Ravenloft, these vibrantly dressed nomads provide one of the few splashes of color in an otherwise muted land. And it's here that you'll also find the most famous of these mist wanderers, Madame Ava, who often practices her own form of ritual witchcraft and performs fortune readings near the water's shores, which the Vistani people believe to possess mystical properties. To the north of Vallaki lies the vast Lake Zarovich, easily the domain's largest body of water. It lies at the foothills of Mount Baratok, its glassy, still waters being fed from the Luna River. The lake, while rich with fish, shimmers with a sense of unease, its silence amplifying the pervasive loneliness that defines Barovia. Stories, legends, and rumors abound of fishermen vanishing from that lake without a trace, their boats later found adrift near heavily fogged shores. Quite possibly the single most defining characteristic of this realm, however, is the persistent grim climate. The sun, almost thought of as just a rumor, does exist but rarely makes its presence known, perpetually hidden behind thick clouds that seldom break, its pale dimness limiting its life-sustaining warmth. Rain is perhaps the most reliable aspect of Barovia, its overcast skies providing everything from days-long light misty drizzles to bursts of heavy torrential downpours, each soaking the valley in a cold, wet malaise. Thunderstorms are a common spectacle, its peals echoing across the valley as brilliant cracks of blue, white-hot lightning streak across a sky that mostly only changes from black to gray. While the rain may, however rarely, cease its wet, clammy embrace of the land, and even the clouds can break for a brief reminder that sunlight does actually still exist here, the mists of Barovia are a most dominant presence, never letting you get too comfortable, dry, or optimistic. If the grim climate is the realm's most defining natural element, then the dread mists that often close the borders of this valley are perhaps the realm's most defining supernatural element. And it is important to pause here to identify another early fork in the lore road ahead, between the original AD&D and 3rd edition texts and the more modern writings of the 5th edition. If you are relying on your knowledge of this domain of dread from the Curse of Strahd 5e resource, then you are under the belief that Barovia is eternally surrounded by deadly border mists that prevent any travel to or from this realm. But you should know that is a lore construct restricted to those 5th edition texts that support Barovia being permanently isolated from any other domains. And this is simply not the case in the original lore, where Barovia has open borders to all its neighbors. That is, unless the Dark Lord Strahd decides to close the borders, which he can do at will. During those times of Dark Lord control, the border mists do indeed take on those sinister 5e properties. However, whether the borders have been closed or not, any warm-blooded and breathing soul would best be served by avoiding the mists, anywhere, anytime, whenever possible. And if the mists of Barovia don't get you, its blighted flora or fauna just might. Travelers who stray far from the known roads do so at great risk, and many are the tales of those who have met their end under the forest's dark canopy, victims to the land itself or to the collection of dread beings that call those woods home. And those perils are numerous, many known and perhaps even more unknown, falling into the black oblivion of hidden sinkholes masked by dead leaves, or the fetid bogs and swamps of sickly green that bubble with unseen dangers. Ravens, often associated with omens in other lands, serve as cryptic observers in Barovia, their watchful presence hinting at an intelligence far beyond their nature. Bandits, cruel and selfish, likely the least of these worries, lurk in the shadows, their hidden faces eager to prey upon the unwary, but perhaps will only take your coin. The direwolves, however, will offer no such sanctuary. Their eyes glow with an unnatural intent and stalk the edges of the woods, prowling in unnervingly large packs. Their howls a constant warning of the perils surrounding you. And rumors abound that even worse await. Beings who walk on two legs yet afflicted with a lycanthropic curse, their human features twisted into masks of feral hunger and a lunatic madness. And then there are the undead servants of the Dark Lord. Bound to Strahd's will, these agents of decay and death may offer the worst outcomes yet. This is all to say, stay on the roads, even in the daylight. These woods are no place to plan a picnic. Barovia's geography is really intrinsic to the domain. Every mountain, river, and settlement tells its own story of struggle, despair, misery, and dread, all under a sky of bleak grays and bruised purples. Each is a reflection of the curse that defines the realm, and of course, the Dark Lord who rules it. The butcher wiped the axe clean with a cold, practiced hand, but his gaze betrayed a shadow of regret as he returned to his normal duties. The crowd dispersed, each citizen clutching their fear as tightly as they did their tattered cloaks. Old man Gregor reached for his daughter's hand. "Papa, why do they do this?" the girl asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gregor's heart clenched. What could he say that would make her understand when he barely understood himself? He only tightened his grip on her hand, leading her back to their desolate fields. There was work yet to do. Barovia's governance is a study in terror, control, and oppression. The land operates under this authoritarian monarchy, with Strahd as its unchallenged sovereign. The most tangible of the many oppressions laid upon the citizens of Barovia is this heavy weight of taxation and the realities of not meeting its demands. Strahd requires severe tribute from its populace, a policy that enriches the Count and a select cadre of loyal nobles while leaving the common Barovians destitute and hopeless. Entire families toil away from dawn till dusk, yet see little benefit from their work, the fruits of their labor siphoned away to fill the coffers of Castle Ravenloft and maintain a veneer of opulence for Strahd and his chosen allies. This system of taxation fosters widespread poverty and a class divide between the impoverished majority and the wealthy elite, a deliberate construct that further reinforces the social hierarchy and ensures Strahd's dominance remains unquestioned. The brutality is found in the enforcement of this system, where Strahd relies on a network of human collaborators and supernatural enforcers. Disobedience, defiance, or being just a few coins short come tax time are met with swift and public punishment, the executioner's axe being only the most visible of Strahd's methods of control. It is widely accepted that unseen eyes and ears lurk in every village, their lips quick to report any hint of dissent. A single loose word spoken in a moment of outward disrespect shown to authority, and a family might find themselves dragged from their beds in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Even the children know to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, lest they draw the attention of the shadows that patrol after dark, a reminder of the Count's watchful gaze, and of course his terrible wrath. The burgomasters of the realm, a medieval title in form of a town's magistrate or mayor appointed by Strahd or his agents, are not protectors of the people. but rather extensions of the heartless demand emanating from Castle Ravenloft. They often turn a blind eye to the suffering, both victims and perpetrators in the cruel system, their own lives spared only as long as they fulfill their duty to the Count. They dare not show any sympathy or weakness, lest they too find themselves facing the axe of the executioner. They've become masters of the apathetic and cold. Among Strahd's most loyal of human supporters is the Wachter family, who according to the original lore held their estate just outside of Krezk in an area called Krezk Pass. But curiously, they've been moved to Vallaki in the 5th edition lore. This is easily reconciled, however, by simply giving them 2 tracts of land on which they have manors. They're not only a noble family, but they've long allied with Strahd after all. For less public deeds and tasks, Strahd often relies on minions with far less free will, playing another important role, fear, all part of maintaining his authority. These mostly unseen creatures patrol in the shadows, where they enforce Strahd's will, either by eliminating those who pose a threat, or to bring them to Castle Ravenloft, where more often than not, they're never seen again. The gray skies were turning black as old man Gregor looked up from the muddy fields to see the bleak day begin to turn into night. His lowered gaze watched his family hunched over in the barren fields, their backs aching and hands raw. The sight of his daughter in particular hurt his soul deeply. She was still a child, yet never actually had a childhood. The few turnips and potatoes they managed to harvest were meager and worm-ridden, hardly enough to keep the hunger at bay. Old man Gregor knew that each would be scrutinized before the lion's share would be taken by the burgomaster for what meager pittance they would receive, most of which would then go straight into the Count's coffers. Gregor and his wife exchanged knowing glances. Words were not needed or advised. There were ears everywhere. They both knew this was wrong, that this was hardly a life, yet they would toil on again tomorrow and the next. For what little hope they had of surviving another winter lay in the meager food and coin they could scrape together. Yet even this, the old man thought, was still better than the glint of that axe. To call Barovia a pocket realm is an apt descriptor, as the entirety of the domain encompasses less than 250 square miles. Now, I've seen other scholars reference the 234 square miles that make up the real-world city of Chicago as a comparable to Barovia. However, I personally find that to be pretty misleading because Chicago is also home to over 2.7 million people. Researching across all known sources and editions of Barovia's history, on the other hand, yields the most optimistic of population totals, ranging between 25 and 30,000, or less than 0.1% of those that call the Windy City home. But it should also be noted that this estimate would be further reduced by a factor of 10 should you choose to leverage the most recent 5th edition lore. As noted on page 25 of the Curse of Strahd adventure, the 5e version of Barovia is said to support less than 3,000 total people across the realm. The 3rd edition lore, specifically volumes of the Ravenloft Gazetteer, arrived at their greater estimate of souls by counting larger towns such as Zeidenburg and Teufeldorf, settlements which have been completely discarded from the 5e lore. And speaking of souls, the lore is further complicated by the fact that, again, according to the 5th edition lore, only an estimated 1 in 10 Barovians actually possess a soul, which is both new lore and also begs the question if 90% of Barovians should even be classified as people. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Regardless of the number of people, or souls, those that call Barovia home have been shaped by centuries of conflict, cultural isolation, and of course, the oppressive pale hand of Count von Zarovich. Humans dominate the realm's demographics, comprising nearly 98% of the total population, with the remaining 2% divided between a nebulous grouping we shall call others. Within that overwhelming human population, about 95% of those are either Barovian or Gundharakite. Barovians, with the most native roots to the land, having descended from the original settlers of the Balanox, are a sturdy and resilient people with a physical appearance that reflects the grim reality of their daily life. Generations of living under perpetual gloom and the ominous watch of Castle Ravenloft have instilled in them a cautious nature and an ingrained wariness of outsiders. It might surprise you to learn, as it did me, that in total the Barovians only account for approximately 44% of the domain's citizens, which, again, according to our 2nd and 3rd edition lore we're using as canon, is of a realm-wide population of under 30,000. The other primary ethnic group of people long established in the early lore, but who are completely non-existent in the 5e texts, are the Gundarakites. Technically a conquered society, the Gundarakites trace their lineage to the former domain of Gundarok, ruled by Duke Gundar and dragged into the mist as another domain of dread circa 593 BC. Gundarok would later be subjugated by Strahd after he annexed the region just under a century and a half later in 740 BC, and just 4 years after the Grand Conjunction. History tells of a Gundarok annexation that was a brutal period of conflict, marked by large-scale massacres and a forced integration under Barovia. This defeat having left the Gundarakites with a deep-seated hatred of their Barovian overlords and, of course, Strahd himself. Because of this, Gundarakites continually face oppression from native Barovians, openly resenting and treating them as second-class citizens, creating a clear divide between the two groups. Today, the Gundarakites are far more concentrated, mostly living in the far western regions of Barovia, but actually make up a slight majority, estimated to be just under 50% of the realm's citizenry. Their traditions, though diminished, still persist in secret, and it has been long thought that many Gundarakites have rejected the worship of Barovian deities in favor of venerating Erlin, a demonic figure associated with death and rebellion, whose worship is as much a defiance of Strahd as it is any form of spiritual practice. Oral histories recounting the bloodshed, the manner and methods in which their homeland fell, and heroic tales of Gundarok rebellion are passed from one generation to the next, preserving their cultural identity despite enduring decades of persecution. Even today, Gandarakite uprisings, though rare, have happened, but each results in swift and ruthless crackdowns by Strahd's forces. Ironically, in terms of physical appearances, the Barovians and Gundarakites are, at least to an outsider's eye, almost identical, a fact that both sides resent bitterly. Both groups are characterized by their thick, stocky builds, broad shoulders, coarse, dark hair, and skin tones typically in the hue of a pale olive. The only common difference an outsider might use to distinguish the two visually would be a Gandarakite preference for adding a small splash of muted color to their clothing. Nothing like the nomadic Vistani, but enough to set them apart from the more somber and earthy tones favored by the Barovians. For some really obscure lore that I found to be a great example of the attention to detail by 3rd edition authors, we have to take a look at the cultures of both groups. Both the Gundarakites and Barovians have a long-standing tradition that has sparked a great deal of their extreme, shall we say, dislike for one another. The women of both ethnic groups each have a traditional custom of wearing a headscarf as part of their daily attire. However, the purpose of this headwear could not be any more diametrically opposed, with Barovian women wearing the scarf to signify that they are married, while Gundarakite women wear the same type of scarf to indicate they are unattached and potentially looking to wed. Talk about some awkward courting. This polar difference in what are a centuries-old custom for both people, and that neither is willing to change, is a source of ongoing tension and some notable lore telling us of all-out brawls between the two groups, giving off some real Hatfield and McCoy type vibes. Looking to the other minority factions who, unlike the Gundarakites and Barovians, you'll have no issue identifying visually, we move on to the Forfarians and Thani ethnicities that have migrated to Barovia, each standing apart in their own unique way. The Forfarians, refugees from the southern domain of Forlorn, are generally more lean in build, with pale, freckled complexions and hair that ranges from very light browns to auburns and reds, tints that the Barovian people often regard with prejudice, suspicion, or sometimes even mystical connotations. Then there are the Thani, arriving in Barovia and settling in around the town of Immol in 585 BC. Visually, the Thani appear to be an amalgamation of many various ethnicities. This actually makes sense given that any Thani you find in Barovia are almost certain to be the lucky few refugees that were able to escape alive from the alien caverns that lie underneath the Lovecraftian domain of Bluetspur, which before the Grand Conjunction could be found in the extreme southeast of the core, kind of like Florida is to the US, which is so very fitting. While the Thani have no consistent defining physical characteristics, it is not uncommon to find striking physical abnormalities. These include having no hair whatsoever, distinct body markings, or strange eyes, such as pure white irises. Finally, there are the 2%ers, and not in a good way, that we grouped in the others category. These others consist of rare realm outsiders, half Vistani, a few clans of deep mountain dwarves, marginalized halflings, tribes of wild elves that call the Teperich forest home, and the Caliban, which are a collection of humanoids born from the influence and breeding of vampires, demons, and hags, among many other demi-humans. The Forfarians and Thani each deserve their own chapters and will be profiled more deeply when we cover their own domains of origin in future volumes, but it is the Dusk Elves that I think are worth detailing for just a moment. The lore of the 4th edition first introduced Dungeons & Dragons at large to the Dusk Elves in Dragon Magazine number 382 back in 2009. But it wasn't until 3 years later in 2012's Dungeon Magazine number 207 and the Fair Barovia Adventure that the Dusk Elves found their way through the mists and into Ravenloft, doing so in the form of a specific Dusk Elf clan called the Velakovnas. Considered traitors among other elves, the morose and distrustful Dusk Elves fit right in with a heavy blanket of despair that is Barovia. Further solidified in 5e through the Curse of Strahd adventure, we learn that the tragedy of these Dusk Elves is tied to their history with the von Zarovich family. Just to be clear, we are again at one of the lore forks, diverging away from the original early lore, the Dusk Elf introduction being specific to the 4th and 5th edition. Still, the Dusk Elves are compelling, and the modern lore is pretty well detailed, including all the hallmarks and sharp edges of Gothic horror, betrayal, love, loss, and it wouldn't be Ravenloft without ample dark cruelty. Suffice to say that with the assistance of the Dusk Elf trader Rahadin, a new NPC from the 5e adventure that would be familiar to anyone that has played or read the Curse of Strahd adventure, the Dusk Elves have become a dying race that carry a truly sorrowful legacy, tied directly to quite possibly one of the most vile of Strahd's many torments. This comes in the form of Strahd's decree that had all Dusk Elf women slaughtered in order to prevent the bloodline from continuing. Those Dark Elves who survive are many centuries old, living out what is left of their lives, bound by the crushing weight of grief and loss. As such, they are quite rare and exist on the fringes of Barovian society. Their presence a bitter and inhumane reminder that this is a heartless realm ruled by the most ruthless of vampire lords. There are a few characteristics of this domain of dread that we need to cover at the outset of this chapter. While I have already covered the significant difference in realm populations between the two eras of lore, 5e really leans heavily into the themes of gloom and misery, and not just in terms of climate or just the village of Barovia, instead choosing to cover the entire domain with this same coat of dark gray paint. In the 5th edition lore of Barovia, formal education is a foreign concept. There are very few skilled craftsmen, and trade is simply non-existent. The latter explained, as we've covered in previous volumes, by the 5e lore placing each of the well over 50 domains of dread, including Barovia, in their own isolated demi-plane, each now forever detached and isolated from one another. In a 5e world, there are no more day trips to Borca for a banking loan or a quick carriage ride south into Hasland for some arcane supplies or enchantments. While I personally don't care for such isolation, I will concede that being 100% detached from any of the other domains or people would turn Barovia into a third world economy. And this is reflected accurately in the 5th edition, and is also likely the reason the realm itself has been reduced so significantly in scale. Because of this cultural segregation, practically every commoner of Barovia has been forced to become subsistence farmers and fishers, each waging a daily struggle just to exist. The backbone of the 5th edition realm economy, lack thereof, is the desperate battle with the land to produce, well, anything. However, the soil tainted by the dark energies of the realm, very little sunlight, and short growing seasons result in reluctant and meager crop growth and fishing yields. And this is regardless of which Barovian town one resides in the 5th edition. Realm-wide survival is the only goal, as any hope of prosperity was dashed long ago. Now, I tell you all this because if your experience is only with the 5th edition settlements and towns of Barovia, you will find much of this chapter both unfamiliar and at odds with a lot of what is laid out in the Curse of Strahd adventure lore for 5th edition. The original lore of Barovia paints with a much different brush. While the realm is certainly full of gloom, it is also far more diverse and nuanced, with settlements and towns, most of which are not even mentioned in the 5th edition, having their own distinct traits, cultures, and economies. So, proceeding with that groundwork laid, there is one word you will rarely use in the context of the realm of Barovia, and most certainly not in 5th edition, and that word is city. Settlements, hamlets, villages, even towns, but there are no true cities within this domain of dread. We will start, just for completeness, with some brief words on the village that shares the name of this domain of dread, Barovia, or more properly, the village of Barovia, a somber and desolate place that among all the locales we're about to cover is the only one that aligns closely with the modern 5e lore. With a population barely reaching 500, even the 2nd or 3rd edition version of Barovia is painted with that 5th edition coat of gray paint. It is small, claustrophobic, and the textbook example of misery put to the eye test, so much so that at times one might easily mistake the village as abandoned. The buildings here are decayed and run down, many with roofs sagging, crooked chimneys, all under the weight of countless harsh winters. There's not much on offer in Barovia, save for Bildrath's Mercantile, established in the first Ravenloft adventure, I-6, and the only place to find general goods, although beyond overpriced and often scarce. There are at least not one but 2 taverns in the village with which to drown your sorrowful life. The seedy Wolf's Den Tavern, added in the 4th edition Fair Barovia adventure, and Barovia's most notable point of interest, the Blood of the Vine Tavern. While each offer that temporary alcohol-fueled escape from misery, the latter also serves as the headquarters for a secret society of were-ravens who are hell-bent on the destruction of Strahd. No one stays in the village of Barovia long unless they have to, so moving west along Old Svalich Road, we find the strategically and centrally located Vallaki, a walled town of approximately 1,500 people. Situated just south of Lake Zarovich, Vallaki is divided into upper and lower sections, serves as the realm's main trading hub, and is considered the most prosperous of the Barovian settlements. Its sturdy palisade and vigilant guards make it a refuge for those seeking shelter from Barovia's dangers, though its own internal politics and secrets often prove just as perilous as the threats outside its walls. And for those that believe in such, Vallaki is where those seeking the guidance of a mystic or a medium are most commonly found. In addition to being the center of Barovia's strong fishing economy, Vallaki is also home to Tybor's smithy, which continues a tradition of skilled craftsmanship, as well as a number of prestigious fruit orchards and the Romulich distillery. The Blue Water Inn is also located here as well. This ancient hunting lodge turned modestly upscale inn offers an excellent view of Lake Zarovich, quality rooms, good food, and complimentary suka, which is a traditional Barovian plum brandy made by the aforementioned Romulich distillery. Vallaki is also home to many estates of nobility, and as you can likely guess, everything here is exceedingly expensive. Among the darker points of interest, if you venture into the Vallaki graveyard, you can find the Vault of Quinn Roche, a tomb rumored to contain several magical suits of armor. And there's also the Old Markov House, which serves as a historically grim reminder of some truly Lamortia levels of experimental horror that have left the home cursed. And there are persistent rumors that Vallaki harbors many arcane secrets, with whispers and rumors that some dark magic and those who would practice it are drawn to the town by the ancient arcane signatures of lingering demonic servitors to the Turgs, an invading force which I covered in Volume 2 of this series. The last two notable locations include the Invich Orphanage, housed in a former manor estate, and most interesting to me as a world builder, the Kargatane Bookshop, which also operates as a front for a cell of the Kargat. I find the Kargat pretty fascinating. They are an organization of spies and assassins, mostly comprised of lycanthropes, vampires, and other intelligent undead. More than a stereotypical covert guild, the best world-building analog I can provide is to visually think of them as an order of feared secret police, where everyone knows they exist and knows they work for the Dark Lord of Darkon, Azul Rex. The Kargatane, on the other hand, are an actual super-secret network of clandestine, mostly human supporters, followers, and henchmen of the Kargat, who have slowly come under the influence and control of Kargat Nosferatu. While the public is aware of the Kargat as they serve as a policing force of sorts, the public is completely unaware of the Kargatane and their supporting activities as a network of spies and informants. Vallaki is a very interesting town with tons of potential adventure hooks that are sadly not represented in the modern text, which is one of the many reasons this Volume 3 exists. As we near the northwestern border of Barovia, threatening to cross into Borka, we find the town of Krezk, near the base of Mount Baratok and adjacent to a lake bearing the same name fed by the runoff from the mountain springs. Its population of 2,000 makes it slightly larger than Vallaki, surprising to many simply because the town feels far more isolated due to its remote location. As one might expect as we move further west, Krezk has a higher concentration of Gondarakites than most any other Barovian town, and prospers from the trade into Borka and other northwestern domains via the Old Svalich Road. Its burgomaster, Ivan Wachter, represents the last of the old Barovian noble families to retain any significant power, the Wachter family being most notable in this era for their ownership of a thriving copper mine. The town walls of Krezk, its heavy defenses and organized layout reflect its historical resilience, with 4 distinct quarters dedicated to commerce, trade, residency, and worship. The town even retains the architectural scars and remnants from the Turg siege over 4 centuries ago, the most prominent of which is a minaret called the Needle of Gadar. The Sanctuary of the First Light highlights the spiritual, the temple serving as the cult of the Morning Lord, and secretly houses the Dawnslayers, an underground faction dedicated to hunting vampires and the undead. The Shrine of the White Sun is another ancient temple within Krezk, having played many roles in Strahd's schemes over the centuries. The Smoldering Ember Inn provides food and beverage, and finally, and maybe most infamous, Krezk is also home to the infamous Red Vardo traders, reputed to be willing to do anything in the name of finding what their clients ask for by any means necessary. But easily the most interesting character lore you're going to find in Krezk, and maybe any of Barovia's towns, is the tale of beauty, greed, and the curse of Jacqueline Montari. Born in 469 BC in Krezk, Jacqueline grew to be both a skilled thief and one of Barovia's most beautiful women. Her obsession with preserving her beauty had led her to seek the aid of Madame Eva, the ancient mystic of the nomadic Vistani. However, Madame Eva refused to help initially, and Jacqueline's desperation turned to violence, an act which would end up sealing her fate. Following Eva's cryptic and forced guidance, Jacqueline broke into Count Strahd von Zarovich's library in search of answers, but only found Strahd himself waiting, set up by Madame Eva. Captured and executed by beheading, her punishment did not end with death. The Zarovian tribe retrieved Jacqueline's body and cursed her with a cruel immortality. They hid her severed head, her prized possession, and returned her to life as a headless entity worthy of any Futurama episode or Beetlejuice remake. Jacqueline soon discovered she could survive by donning stolen heads secured by a magical ribbon, though each head aged rapidly under the curse and thus fueled her endless quest to find her original head, which has consumed her existence ever since. Still residing in Krezk, Jacqueline leads the Red Vardo traders, using their network in her continued search for her lost head and beauty. Zeidenburg, Barovia's largest settlement with a population of 4,600, lies along the Crimson Road at the western frontier of the domain. Originally a key town in the former domain of Gundarok, it was annexed into Barovia after the assassination of Duke Gundar during the Grand Conjunction. The Ashen Stronghold is the physical reminder of this conflict. The remains of a rebel fortress, this architectural artifact marks the site of Gundarok's final resistance against Strahd's subjugation. The stronghold fell after a devastating siege during which swarms of rats spread disease and death throughout the town. Though decades have passed, Zeidenburg still bears scars from this rebellion. Despite its strategic importance as a trade hub on the Gundar River, Zeidenburg remains a volatile and divided community. The town's Gundarokite majority harbor deep resentment toward their Barovian overlords, fueling separatist movements and frequent unrest. The tension is exacerbated by the presence of brigands in the surrounding countryside and an active black market within the town itself. The two tavern inns of Zeidenburg reflect that town's duality as both a thriving trade center and a haven for corruption and vice. The Bloated Leech is a hub for black market dealings, from illicit goods to contract killings despite its squalid conditions, while the Grizzled Boar caters to the more conventional travelers and foreign merchants. The city's history of rebellion, coupled with its current instability, make it one of Barovia's most dangerous, yet also fascinating locales, especially if you're world building. In the center of Zeidenburg, you might be surprised to find the opulent manor of one Lysa von Zarovich. As a scion of the infamous von Zarovich bloodline, Lysa is a potent and ambitious vampire herself, whose own story is one of defiance and tragedy. Her open sympathy for Gundarokite separatists are frowned upon by Barovia's nobility, adding another layer of intrigue to the political landscape of Zeidenburg. Born in 525 BC as the granddaughter of Sturm von Zarovich, making her the grandniece of Count Strahd von Zarovich, Lysa grew up hearing tales of her family's fallen empire. These stories fueled her determination to reclaim what she saw as her rightful legacy. Unlike many vampires in Barovia, Lysa achieved her transformation without Strahd's intervention, but her methods were quite unorthodox. She actually manipulated her own aging process by marrying a man, turning him into a revenant, and allowing him to attack her, a bold move for sure to increase her own power, now rivaling older vampires. Lysa's defiance of Strahd reached its peak with her alliance with the god brain of Bluetspur. Together they sought to create vampiric mind flayers, horrific hybrids intended to overthrow Strahd and reshape Barovia. The scheme obviously failed, and failed disastrously, with the creatures proving uncontrollable. Strahd's patience with his rebellious grandniece finally ran out in 750 BC when he orchestrated her poisoning, This has long rendered Lysa weakened and lethargic, limiting her activity to only a few hours a night. But Lysa is nothing if not persistent, and she continues to conspire against Strahd from afar. She surrounds herself with thralls both living and undead and performs dark rituals in a desecrated druidic circle within the Teperich forest. Despite her setbacks, Lysa remains a formidable adversary. Her intelligence, mastery of biomancy, and ambition to overthrow Strahd and reverse her family's cursed legacy make Lysa von Zarovich an exceptional add to a Ravenloft campaign, one that could provide some really unique and unexpected avenues for adventure. Teufeldorf rests along the Gundar River in southern Barovia with a population of approximately 3,500. Once part of Gundarach, just like Zeidenburg, it too was annexed into Barovia following the Grand Conjunction, marked by the bloody Teufeldorf massacre after months of rebellion and chaos. Despite its official integration into Barovia, Teufeldorf retains its Gundarachite roots, and tensions between its oppressed Gundarachite majority and the Barovian authorities tasked with quelling resistance remains high. The town is a hotbed of unrest and criminal activity, and much of it can be found in the Weeping Widow Inn if you know who to look for. Teufeldorf is also where you find the Twisting Tower, a structure once associated with Duke Gundar's cabal of arcane spellcasters. Today it serves as a military training facility for Barovian soldiers. Teufeldorf's religious presence is unusually active for Barovia, with two places of worship. The first is called the Refuge of Quiet Diligence, an Ezrite temple. It maintains watch over the domain under the leadership of the local Centaur. Meanwhile, the Hospice of the 300 Wounds, run by Halan witches, provides healing to the sick and afflicted. However, despite these efforts, poverty and crime persist, with beggars and thieves being a common sight. We also make a callback to Volume 2 of this series, as Teufeldorf is the home of the Daemon in Ajira, a fiend now bound to Barovia by his hatred for Strahd and his desire to locate his Book of Keeping. The Arcanoloth resides in a bleak manor stuffed with arcane text and occult artifacts. Now, you won't find them listed in any directory, but trust me when I tell you that the Baal Verzai Assassins Guild calls Teufeldorf its home. The covert association operates in secrecy here while maintaining their legendary reputation as killers for hire. Control of the guild was seized by the Nosferatu Niku Moldenesti in 673 BC, and many are the rumors that the Baal Verzai have made at least 2 attempts to kill the realm's Dark Lord. But after its failure, it now steers clear of Count Strahd von Zarovich, taking the official position that the guild will neither accept a commission for his life, nor would they accept a commission from him for the life of another. Nevertheless, their presence still well underscores the town's role as a center for the shadiest of illicit dealings, contracts, and rebellion. Teufeldorf remains scarred by its violent past, but it continues to resist full assimilation into Barovian rule. Its Gundarachite heritage persists in both its culture and its defiance, making it a must-visit for anyone seeking assistance or information to challenge Strahd's dominion, or even exploit the open chaos for their own needs. Our tour ends at the extreme southeast of Barovia, near the border to Haslan, which is where you'll find Immol, a secluded town of about 1,600 people at the foot of Mount Sawtooth. The Saniset River begins here, though it is unnavigable at this point. Immol is connected to Haslan by the Warlock's Road, making it both a border settlement and a crossroads of cultural exchange. Despite its isolation, Immol has a true distinct identity shaped by its unique population and history. The town's residents include the 2 small but notable ethnic groups we profiled in Chapter 5, the Forfarians and the Thani. Immol's history is marked by its own repeated attempts to assert independence from Count Strahd's rule. These rebellions have been met with brutal reprisals, leaving scars both physical and cultural on the town. Immol does the majority of its trade with Haslin, not Barovia, and routinely imports its finely crafted bowls and other arcane utensils used in magic rituals. Immol is also where you will find the Bolting Stag Inn. While its accommodations would be described as modest at best, its potent whiskey and lamb sausage are local specialties that draw travelers despite the inn's otherwise unremarkable fare. However, Immol's greatest contribution to Barovia is the Archive of Teufeldorf, the only library of Barovian history, legends, and records in all of the realm. Well, outside of Castle Ravenloft anyway, and I don't think Strahd is passing out library cards anytime soon. Well, here we are, my stalwart explorer. We've reached the end of our tour together through this domain of dread, and thus have completed this tome of survival. Minus any actual survival guarantees, of course. Nevertheless, I trust this descent into a Barovia free of its 5th edition restraints has been informative, perhaps even enlightening. Today we have discovered the real Barovia, the one hiding behind the dusty pages of Ravenloft's original lore, a far cry from the, shall we say, simplified narratives of the modern era. And hopefully our journey has sparked something within you. That is, if you survive, of course. Whether your ambition is to finally stake that melodramatic count or simply to claw your way out of this perpetually overcast nightmare by tooth and nail, this deeper understanding of Barovia's true nature is your edge. Think of it like knowing the cheat codes to a particularly unfair video game, though in this game the game over screen involves significantly more screaming, and blood, and pain, endless pain. You'll be fine. And if you paid attention, you now know you have many potential allies. Always remember, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And we're friends, right? So like, subscribe, and enable notifications. It's like having a Vistani seer predict the future of my upload schedule. Equally reliable. Probably. And for exclusive content that's darker than a banshee's wail, check out my Patreon. You might even find a cursed artifact or two. Digitally, of course. A sincere thank you to my Patreon and channel supporters that make this video possible, and thank you for listening. Until our next journey of discovery, take care, my friends.